Hi, my name is Brandon Enright, and this is the second video in my series on the parity of twisty puzzles, or the concept of parity in the pieces of twisty puzzles. This video is not going to be comprehensive. You really should see part 1 for a refresher if you haven't seen it. But here I want to focus on the parity of some other puzzles besides just the Rubik's Cube or flipping glass jars. So, as everyone probably knows, the 4x4x4 cube has what people call a parity problem, or a parity issue, or a parity error. What does that mean? So, parity refers to the number of swaps needed to perform a particular cycle. And so if I do a quarter turn of the face of this puzzle, of the U face of this puzzle, I did a 4 cycle of corners. A 4 cycle is an odd permutation because it requires 3 swaps, and 3 is an odd number. So, let's take a look at some of the other pieces on this puzzle. This puzzle no longer has middle edges like a Rubik's Cube, so it no longer quite stays the same. So if I do a quarter turn here, I did an odd permutation of the corners because it's an even cycle, a 4 cycle. What kind of cycle did I do for these middle edge wings? I actually did 2 4 cycles. I did this middle edge to there, that middle edge to there, that middle edge to there. Okay, let me just do it. This middle edge. Okay, I got it wrong. Okay, so I did this middle edge to there, this middle edge to there, this middle edge to there, and that middle edge to there. Okay? And I also did this middle edge to here, this middle edge to here, this middle edge to here, this middle edge to here. So I did 2 4 cycles of the middle edges. So I did a 4 cycle in the corners, and I did 2 4 cycles in the middle edges, or the edge wings. So I changed the parity of the corners. I did not change the parity in the edge wings because I did 2 even cycles, or yeah, 2 even cycles which have odd parity, and 2 odd parities are even. Hopefully you followed me there. I also did a 4 cycle of these middle centers, the centers on the 4x4x4. So when I change the parity of the corners, and I don't change the parity of the edge wings, I do change the parity of these middle centers, but you can't see it because they're all identical. Let me show you on. Okay, here is a unscrambled face on this super 4x4x4. So I'm going to do a quarter turn. And you can see that I did a 4 cycle of these middle centers. Now I've done a 2 swap. I've swapped those and swapped those, just like I swapped the corners. So start out even permutation, odd permutation, even permutation, odd permutation, even permutation. Back to solved. So when you do a turn on the outer face of a 4x4x4, you change the parity of the corners, you change the parity of the centers, but you do not change the parity of these edges. Now, there's another type of move on a 4x4x4, that's a slice move. So let's take a look at what a slice move does. We already know that a slice move doesn't change corners at all. So corners stay completely in, their parity does not change. Okay, so if I do a slice move, I'm doing a edge to here, to here, to here, to here. I'm doing a 4 cycle of these edge wings. 4 cycle changes their parity because a 4 cycle is it's an odd cycle. It's an even, no, excuse me. It is a even permutation. No, boy, I'm getting my terminology all mixed up here. It's an even cycle, because a 4 cycle is an even cycle, but it's an odd permutation. Sorry, the terminology does get confusing. It flips the parity. That's all that really matters. Okay, so a slice move. It also does 2 4 cycles in these middle centers, or the X centers. So took this one, put it to there, that one, put it to there, that one, put it to there, and that one, put it to there. That's 1 4 cycle. And it took this one, put it to there, this one, put it to there, this one, put it to there, and this one, put it to there. So it does 2 4 cycles in the centers. So it changes the parity of the wings, the edge wings, and it does not change the parity of the centers, which means on this puzzle, oh, and it also doesn't change the parity of the corners, which means on this puzzle, a single quarter slice turn changes the parity of these edges, but doesn't change the parity of any of these other pieces, which means in principle, you can cycle all of these other pieces back to their original positions without cycling the outer edge wings to their original positions, which means you can have just 2 edge wings that are swapped. You can have a single swap, because a single swap is an odd permutation. Yeah, it's an odd permutation because it requires 1 and 1's odd. And so you can have a single swap of these edges. You can have them across the puzzle, you can have them next to each other, you can have them pretty much anywhere you want on the puzzle. And so when people are solving the 4x4x4, they typically reduce the centers, and then they pair up these edges, and they can run into a situation where they have 2 that are swapped, and they call it a parity error. What the parity error really means is that what they need to do is they need to do a quarter turn of the middle slice, and then they just need to recycle everything while always maintaining an even number of quarter turns so that they don't change the parity again. Then that will fix the parity issue, and it'll allow them to pair up all the edges nicely. So, on a 4x4x4, you can do a pure odd cycle, or excuse me, odd permutation, even cycle, odd permutation of the edge wings without affecting any other piece on this puzzle, and you can just look at it by looking at the parity of the pieces based on the types of turns that you can do on the puzzle. Now let's look at a 5x5x5. So on a 5x5x5, the analysis is basically the same. So doing a quarter turn changes the parity of the corners. It also changes the parity of these middle edges, just like on a 3x3x3. And it does, just like on a 4x4x4, it changes the parity of these X centers, and it changes the parity of these middle centers, the plus centers, and it twists this center. And if you look at a slice turn, let's look at the same slice turn that we were looking at on the 4x4x4. It does a even cycle of these edge wings, which is an odd permutation, a 4 cycle odd permutation. But it also does a 4 cycle of these middle edges. So when you do a slice move on a 5x5x5, you change the parity of the edge wings, but you also change the parity of these middle edges. Therefore, if you try to do, if you're solving a super 5x5x5 like this, and you ever run into a situation where you have 2 edges swapped and all the corners are fine, you're also going to run into a situation where an odd number of swaps are needed to solve all of these plus centers, the middle centers. So you can't change the parity with a slice move. You can't change the parity of these edges without also changing the parity of these plus centers. Now, it does get a little bit trickier, because if I do a U-turn on a 5x5x5, I change the parity of the corners, I change the parity of these middle centers, the plus centers, but I do not change the parity of the edge wings, because it does 2 4 cycles, and 2 4 cycles overall is an even permutation. So, if you have, you can run into a situation where all of these middle edges are in their correct spot, and you have, all the edge wings are in the correct spot, and you have 2 plus centers that are swapped. but you know that that implies that you must also have two corners that are swapped, because the only way to decouple the parity of these middle, the plus centers, from the edge wings, the only way to decouple their parity is to perform a U-turn, which also changes the parity of the corners. And so you can use the parity analysis of these pieces to determine which situations are possible, or if you know something about a situation, you know other things about the situation too. That's why parity is a very, very, very useful tool. So let me recap that. I'm going to just say it again. I'll try to say it slowly. If you run into a situation where you have all of these middle edges, or excuse me, all of the edge wings already solved on the puzzle relative to the centers here, but then the plus centers, these centers, are not solved and they require an odd number of swaps, that means that the corners also must require an odd number of swaps. And if they require an even number of swaps while all these edge wings are solved, then the corners must require an even number of swaps also. Or the other situation is that if all of the corners are solved and all of the middle edges are solved and everything is solved, but you have two edge wings that are swapped, then you must also have you must have an odd number of swaps needed in the plus centers. So you can just look at the types of moves that are available on the puzzle. Turns like this. Slice turns like this. Well, and there's also slice turns like this, but they're not interesting, so I skipped them. You can figure out what sort of parity restrictions are on this puzzle. Now, this is also a 4x4x4, but it's a really interesting one because it has a 2x2x2 on the inside of it. So this is, I think, the crazy 4x4x4 one by MF8. Yeah, I think it's MF8. And when you turn a face, the centers don't turn. But when you turn the slice, the centers do turn. That makes this piece, these three, correspond to the corners of a 2x2x2. So if you scramble this like it's a 2x2x2, you'll be able to see that. So when we were talking about the 4x4x4, and we were talking about if I do a move like this, it changes the parity of the corners, but it does not change the parity of these edge wings. But doing a middle slice does change the parity of the edge wings. Now there's an additional set of pieces, the 2x2x2 corners on the inside of this puzzle. So if I change the parity of the edge wings, I don't change the parity of these outer pieces. These outer crescent pieces are the same piece as a 4x4x4 center. But I do change the parity of the 2x2x2 corners on the inside of this puzzle because I did a 4 cycle of the 2x2x2 corners. So you can imagine on the inside, there's a 2x2x2, the corners. And I did a 4 cycle of those corners. So I changed the parity of the corners on the inside of the 2x2x2, and I can see them now because they've been brought to the surface by these circles. So, in the process of solving this puzzle, if your strategy is to first solve the 2x2x2 so that it's completely solved, you know that the 2x2x2 is in an even permutation. That is, it doesn't require any swaps, 0 swaps, so it's in an even permutation. We also know that the permutation of the corners is attached to the permutation of the edge wings. That is, they're both even or both odd. The parity of the permutation, that is. So, if you have solved the inner 2x2x2 on this puzzle, then you know that there is also an even number of swaps needed to solve all of the edge wings. Therefore, if you solve the inner 2x2x2 on this puzzle, you cannot run into a situation where you have 2 edge wings swapped. So you can actually avoid any sort of parity issue on this puzzle by solving the 2x2x2 in the center of this puzzle first, and then always maintaining it as solved the whole rest of the time. And that will force the edge wings to always be in an even permutation. And if they're always in an even permutation, you will never have the case where you need an odd swap, one swap. So that's one of the reasons why keeping track of the parity of pieces in how you turn the puzzle helps you recognize when you could run into a unexpected situation, or when an unexpected situation is actually impossible. Now, here's Megaminx. The only turn possible in Megaminx, you just turn an outer face. Megaminx, this is a pentagon. So it does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It does a 5 cycle of corners. A 5 cycle, that's an odd cycle, but an even permutation. It requires 4 swaps. 4 swaps means it's an even permutation, excuse me. It also does a 5 cycle of middle edges. So every move that you do on a Megaminx does not change the parity. The puzzle starts in an even parity, and it stays in an even parity every single move that you do. Which means that you can never run into a situation where you have 2 corners swapped, ever. And you can never run into a situation where you have 2 centers, or 2 edges swapped, ever. And so you may be wondering, well, does a void Megaminx have the same sort of issue that a void cube has, where you can have where you can change the parity of the middle edges, or the edges, without changing the parity of the corners? And the answer is no, because on a cube, a turn does toggle parities, and so they normally stay attached, but this slice turn doesn't. It changes the parity of just the edges, it doesn't change the parity of the corners. On a Megaminx, the edges and the corners are still in an even permutation. Even, 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 even. And then the slice move on a Megaminx is this really weird move that it's basically you just turn 2 opposite. This slice move, let's take a look at that. The analysis of this thing is kind of crazy. It does 2 5 cycles of the corners. This corner to 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 this corner, and this corner to 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 this corner. 2 5 cycles of the corners. That's 1 5 cycle is even, 2 5 cycles is even, 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 even. It does a 5 cycle of these edges. It does a 5 cycle of these edges. That's 2 5 cycles. Even, 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 even. And it does a 5 cycle of this edge to this edge to this edge, so on and so forth. So it does another 2 5 cycles of these edges. 5 cycles are even, even, even. 2 of them is even. 3 of them is even. 4 of them is even. It doesn't matter how many it does. It stays even. Therefore, on a void Megaminx, no matter what you do, doesn't matter that you don't have centers, you can never have 2 corners swapped, and you can never have 2 edges that are swapped. Doesn't matter if the centers are there or not. You can just look at the parity restrictions of the turns that are available to you to determine whether or not 2 swapped is possible or not. And so if someone hands you this puzzle and 2 are swapped, you know that this puzzle is unsolvable given the moves that are available to you. You must take it apart and swap 2, because you can never go from an odd permutation to an even one if all you have available to you are even cycle, or even permutations, odd cycles, 5 cycles. Hopefully, that has helped explain some of the reasons why parity is useful, and some of the reasons why tracking parity helps you identify potential situations that could arise or couldn't arise. I think that there's a lot more to say about parity. I have some bigger puzzles here. This is, I believe, an 8x8x8. And there are lots of other twisty puzzles where it might be worthwhile to discuss parity, but I'm going to have to save those for a later video. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to address those questions in a third video if needed. Thanks for watching.